By 1943, the War Office had made its decision. The Churchill Tank was finished. Production would end. The Cromwell cruiser tank would take its place. 3 years earlier, the same War Office had rushed this tank into production without proper trials. Now it was being quietly written off. But in April of that same year, in the hills above Tunis, a squadron of these condemned tanks did something no other Allied tank in the theater could do. They drove straight up a near vertical slope, one that German commanders had judged impossible for armor, and took a fortified position from the rear. German prisoners, refugees, refused to believe tanks had done it. Not until they were shown the tracks. The tank the War Office had already cancelled had just saved the road to Tunis. But the real story of the Churchill is not one battle on one hillside. It is the story of a machine that was wrong from the moment it was designed. Too slow, too heavy, built for a war that never came, and that spent 12 years refusing to become obsolete on schedule. Every week, we tell the stories behind the aircraft, the ships, and the decisions that shaped British defense. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins in Luton, at the Vauxhall Motors Works in the summer of 1940. In September 1939, the War Office still expected a war like the last one. Trenches, shell craters, barbed wire stretching across a static front. The specification drawn up that autumn, designated A-20, called for a tank built to survive exactly that. 80 millimeters of armor, a crew of 7, a top speed of only 15 miles per hour, and the ability to climb a 5-foot parapet. Speed was never the point. Survival was. Then France fell. In 6 weeks, the War Office had prepared for became irrelevant, and so did most of Britain's tanks, abandoned on the beaches at Dunkirk. With a German invasion feared within months, the War Office needed a heavily armored infantry tank in production immediately, not eventually. The A-20 design, drawn up by Harland and Wolff, was shelved along with an even heavier alternative, the 80-ton TOG super heavy tank, which proved unworkable almost immediately. 2 designs down. The War Office turned to Vauxhall Motors, a car manufacturer at Luton better known for saloons than armor, and to Dr. H.E. Merritt, director of tank design at Woolwich Arsenal, who rewrote the specification based on what British observers had seen in Poland and France. The revised specification, a 22 Infantry Tank Mark IV, reached Vauxhall in June 1940. The order was for between 500 and 600 tanks, placed directly from the drawing board before a single prototype existed. The exact value of that development contract is not reliably recorded in open sources, but the timeline is. A design finalized in July 1940, a pilot model running by December, and a demand from the War Office that production begin within 12 months of the original order, an almost impossible deadline for an entirely new vehicle from a company that had never built a tank. Merritt's team saw the problem plainly. Britain needed weight and armor. It could not yet build an engine powerful enough to carry its speed. They chose not to solve that problem. They chose to stop trying to solve it and build for endurance instead. The engine came first because it had to fit inside a hull already committed to paper. Vauxhall's engineers took 2 6-cylinder Bedford lorry engines and mated them on a single crankshaft, producing a flat 12 unit they called the Twin 6. 350 brake horsepower, enough to move a 40-ton vehicle, though never quickly. The suspension was where the design became genuinely unusual. 11 pairs of small road wheels, sprung independently and tucked beneath armored side panniers, let the tank flex across broken ground the way a caterpillar flexes across a branch. Rather than a rigid vehicle, a series of small, independent contact points, each one adjusting to the terrain beneath it. That geometry is what let the Churchill climb slopes that stopped every other Allied tank cold. Steering came through the Merritt Brown gearbox, a regenerative system controlled by a tiller bar instead of a steering wheel, meaning the driver could send power to each track independently and pivot the tank on the spot. A neutral turn, in the language of the day. The ability to rotate in place rather than execute a wide arc, essential for a vehicle this size maneuvering in confined ground. None of it worked properly at first. The first 14 production tanks left the Vauxhall line in June 1941, built to a deadline rather than a finished design. Mechanical failures were constant through 1941 and into 1942. Broken tracks, transmission faults, engines that overheated under load. Vauxhall technicians spent the best part of 2 years running revision programs on tanks already issued to units, fixing the design in the field because there had been no time to fix it on the bench. What kept the program alive through those failures was not performance. It was infrastructure. 11 manufacturers, Vauxhall, Broom and Wade, Birmingham Carriage and Wagon, Metropolitan Camel, and others, were drawing on more than 600 subcontractors spread across the country by the time production reached its stride. Cancelling the Churchill in 1941 or 1942 would have meant unpicking an industrial commitment already built into a dozen towns' worth of factory floors. The decision was made. The program had its infrastructure, even before it had its reputation. The 9th Royal Tank Regiment trained on early Churchills at Salisbury Plain through 1942, working out how to drive a tank that steered nothing like the tanks that came before it. The 14th Canadian Army Tank Regiment, the Calgary Regiment, would be the first to take it into combat. They would not have long to wait. On the 19th of August 1942 at Dieppe, the Churchill went to war for the first time, and by most accounts, it went badly. Around 27 to 29 Churchill tanks of the Calgary Regiment landed on the shingle beaches below the town. Sources differ slightly on the exact figure. What they agree on is the terrain. Not sand, but chert, loose stone that jammed between the tracks and road wheels the moment the tanks tried to maneuver. Some never made it off the landing craft. Others reached the seawall and stopped there, immobilized, providing what covering fire they could, while the infantry around them were cut down. Every Churchill landed that day was lost. A German intelligence assessment afterward judged the new British tank unimpressive, old-fashioned, and, in their words, not difficult to defeat. 8 months later, in Tunisia, the same tank proved that assessment wrong. By early 1943, the War Office had already scheduled the Churchill's phase-out, expecting the newer Cromwell cruiser tank to replace it that year. Then, on the 21st of April, 1943, at the Battle of Longstop Hill, tanks of the North Irish Horse descended into a gully between 2 hilltops and climbed slopes with gradients as steep as 1 in 3. Inclines the German defenders had judged impossible for armor to cross. A tank commanded by Sergeant O'Hare reached the summit first, capturing the position's headquarters and 50 prisoners. 3 more tanks followed. German officers on the hill later said that once they saw the tanks appear over the crest, they knew the position was lost. The victory opened the road to Tunis and, by the account of the regiment's own veterans, helped secure the Churchill's continued production that same year. Longstop was not the only proof. At the Second Battle of El Alamein, 6 Churchills demonstrated they could absorb hits that would have destroyed lighter tanks. Weeks before Longstop, 2 Churchills of the 51st Royal Tank Regiment, at what troops nicknamed Steamroller Farm, ambushed and destroyed an entire German transport column, anti-tank guns, half-tracks, 2 Panzer IIIs, without loss. And on April 21, 1943, a Churchill of the 48th Royal Tank Regiment disabled a German Tiger I with a 6-pounder round that deflected into the turret ring. The very Tiger later recovered, restored, and put on display at Bovington. By 1944, the redesigned Mark VII, thicker armor, a new 75mm gun, welded rather than riveted construction, was equipping 3 Royal Armoured Corps regiments in northwest Europe and 1 in Italy. During Operation Veritable, in the Reichswald forest, Churchill tanks crossed ground so waterlogged that other armor had been judged incapable of moving through it at all. and, under Major General Percy Hobart's 79th Armoured Division, the Churchill chassis became the basis for a family of specialist vehicles. The AVRE engineer tank, capable of demolishing bunkers with a huge spigot mortar, and the Crocodile, a flame-throwing variant that could force a fortified position to surrender after a single burst. Further east, 301 Churchills reached the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. 43 lost en route on the Arctic convoys, and fought at Kursk and the Fourth Battle of Kharkov with Soviet heavy tank regiments, though Soviet crews reportedly found the tank unpopular, mechanically demanding by their standards. In total, 5,640 Churchills were built across all marks, the second highest production run of any British tank of the war after the Valentine. By 1945, though, the first real sign of trouble had arrived. Not from the battlefield, but from Whitehall's own procurement pipeline, where a faster, better-armed successor was already on the drawing board. In 1943, the General Staff asked whether a heavier gun could be fitted to Britain's tanks to counter the newest German armour. For the infantry tank line, the answer was the Black Prince. Specification of 43. Essentially a widened Churchill hull carrying the same 17-pounder gun mounted on the Sherman Firefly. Development dragged through 1944 as the design grew heavier and slower than the Churchill it was meant to replace. By early 1945, only 6 Black Prince prototypes existed. In the same period, the new Centurion, faster, similarly armored, and already entering production, offered everything the Black Prince promised, without the compromises. The official reason for cancellation was straightforward. Centurion did the job better. The underlying reason was broader. British armoured doctrine itself was changing, moving away from the whole concept of a separate infantry tank toward a single universal design that could do everything. The Black Prince was cancelled. The infantry tank as a category of British armour effectively ended with it. The Churchill itself did not vanish immediately. It fought on, in shrinking numbers, through the last actions of the war in Europe. At Goch, in February 1945, where Churchill tanks absorbed 38 rounds of German fire on a single vehicle and kept moving. It even saw one final deployment in Korea, where Crocodile tanks of C Squadron, 7th Royal Tank Regiment supported the defense of Seoul in early 1951, and 4 Churchills helped hold the line for the 1st Battalion. Royal Northumberland Fusiliers against Chinese assault. Then the closing came quickly. The regiment left Korea in October 1951. The gun tanks went home. In 1952, the British Army retired every Churchill still in service. No replacement was ordered. There was no replacement to order. Centurion had already taken its place. The capability gap the Churchill had filled. A slow, unstoppable infantry tank built to survive anything. Simply closed because doctrine no longer called for that vehicle at all. The Churchill did not disappear all at once. Long after the gun tank left service, its descendants stayed on. The bridging and recovery variants, built on the same chassis, the same suspension, the same stubborn ability to go where nothing else could, remained in British use into the 1970s. Ireland kept 4 Churchills at the Curragee camp, one running until spares simply ran out, sometime after 1969. Australia held on to its Churchills until 1956. The tank's real inheritance was not a vehicle at all. It was an idea. That a single hull could be reshaped into a dozen specialist tools, engineer tanks, flame tanks, bridge layers, recovery vehicles. That idea, proven under Percy Hobart's command in 1944, shaped how the British Army built specialist armour for the rest of the century. Dr. H.E. Merritt, the man who rewrote the Churchill's specification in the desperate summer of 1940, went on to see his gearbox design used across a generation of British tanks that followed. His name is barely remembered outside specialist circles. His gearbox outlived him in every British tank built for 30 years. Historians remain divided on the honest verdict. By pure engineering standards, the Churchill was never a good tank, underpowered, undergunned for most of its service life, plagued by mechanical failure in its first 2 years. But by the standard that actually mattered in 1940, could Britain field an infantry tank fast enough to matter? And could that tank survive what nothing else could survive? The verdict is less complicated. It did what it was built to do, longer than anyone who designed it expected it to last. If you found this history valuable, give the video a like. It's the single best signal you can send this channel. And if you want more stories about the aircraft, ships, and decisions that shaped British military power, subscribe to UK Defence Archive. We'll see you in the next one. Somewhere at Bovington, a Churchill Mark 7 sits on the museum floor, its hull the same shape it was in 1943, built to climb ground. Nothing else could climb, and still doing it, one demonstration run at a time.